On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, was brutally assassinated in the streets of Sarajevo, thus nudging all major European powers off the precipice of global conflict. Soon, the German armies had invaded Belgium and France and brought to prominence the new tactic of trench warfare. As the war progressed, the web of international alliances grew, and young men from Germany, France, Britain, Russia, and Austria-Hungary engaged in a type of brutal fighting never before seen.
Despite these developments, President of the United States Woodrow Wilson and the U.S. Congress announced U.S. neutrality and non-intervention, a policy that would remain until the last years of the war. On August 19, 1914, President Wilson addressed Congress, saying, "The United States must be neutral in fact as well as in name during these days that are to try men's souls. We must be impartial in thought as well as in action, must put a curb upon our sentiments as well as upon every transaction that might be construed as a preference of one party to the struggle before another." This statement ushered in a time of awkward non-involvement, reflecting divided public opinion in the United States, while brutal conflict and slaughter raged on in Europe.
Nevertheless, 4 years later, this policy abruptly changed as the United States entered the war on the side of the Allies, breaking its promise of neutrality and helping to decide the fate of a conflict that would define the former half of the 20th century. This involvement indicated a sharp change in foreign policy from isolationism to international interventionism.
But what was the impetus for such a drastic turnaround? For years prior to the war, America, through desires for international economic expansion, continually invested large amounts of capital in European markets, especially in Great Britain. Additionally, when the war began, overseas demand for U.S. manufacturing increased and led to an economic boom. This forced the U.S. to pick and choose which countries were to receive aid and supplies in Europe, causing the supposedly neutral nation to unofficially side with the Allies. As the war progressed, and the Germans advanced across Western Europe, the possibility of Britain losing the war threatened American business and economic ties. These trends were one of many factors that led to America's inevitable involvement in the war.
German military forces, in an attempt to strangle the island nation's flow of war aid and goods, put pressure on the British shipping industry by utilizing the new technology of submarines to deter and challenge shipping companies, thus hurting the Allied war effort. The malicious campaigns carried out to weaken British imports affected the entire British seafaring industry. On June 7, 1915, the RMS Lusitania, a British luxury passenger ship of the Cunard Line, carrying over 2,000 passengers, a majority of whom were Americans, was torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat, a submarine which had suspected the ship to be carrying arms and supplies to Great Britain. It turned out that they were mistaken. The ship was carrying no supplies or weapons. Regardless, nearly 200 Americans died in the disaster.
Nicholas Naftel Alls, an American auditor, was aboard the Lusitania that fateful day. He offered this first-hand account. "I shall never forget those 2 hours of drifting. At times we were surrounded by bodies of the dead, and always we could hear the dying shrieks of men and women in the water. We passed the bodies of several babies." Americans were outraged at the incident. One newspaper article characterized it as a deliberate attempt at murder. Former President Theodore Roosevelt disagreed with Wilson's handling of the issue, believing it was just cause to go to war right away. He wrote that he was pretty well disgusted with our government and with the way our people acquiesce in and support it. Roosevelt also wondered out loud what would have happened if Abraham Lincoln had reacted to the firing upon Fort Sumter in the way Wilson had reacted to the Lusitania attack.
The sinking of RMS Lusitania provided an impetus for a brief period of appeasement to the US by the German Navy. However, shortly afterwards, unrestricted submarine warfare resumed, a tipping point for the United States' entry into the war.
It was only one of several causes for mounting public animosity towards the Germans. The devastation and warfare in Europe were unparalleled in their deadliness and level of destruction. New technologies such as gas attacks and trench tactics made life a living hell for the millions of young men fighting the war.
News of these horrific battles and conflicts reached the United States in the form of news reports featured in wildly popular corporate newspapers, as well as in poetry, a popular medium of the time. British soldier-poet Wilfred Owen describes a German mustard gas attack in his poem Dulce et decorum est. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim, through the misty panes and thick green light, as under eye-green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning.
Media such as these helped alert conscientious Americans to the harsh realities and general conditions of the war. Specific incidents such as German atrocities and war crimes sparked even more public outcry and demanded to take action.
Belgium, a tiny country situated between France and Germany, was straight in the path of the advancing German war machine under the Schlieffen Plan at the beginning of the war. Its civilian population was hit hardest by the conflict. In this official report written by U.S. Ambassador to Belgium Brand Whitlock, he describes the atrocities committed there by German troops. During all that month of August, there were inflicted on the civilian population by the hordes that overran it deeds of such ruthless cruelty and unspeakable outrage that one must search history in vain for others like them committed on such a prodigious scale. Towns were sacked and burned, homes were pillaged. In many places, portions of the population, men, women, and children, were massed in public squares and mowed down by mitrailleuses, and there were countless individual instances of an amazing and shameless brutality. Batisse, in the province of Liege, is about 5 kilometers from Bellini. It was pillaged and burned on the 6th of August by Germans who had been repulsed before the forts of Liege. 36 persons, including 3 women, were massacred. The village methodically burned, and the church destroyed.
The report described more individual events, such as one attack upon a village in which 90 civilians were killed, with no discrimination by the perpetrators with regard to age or gender. These events did increase public awareness and, more importantly, diplomatic and political support for the war. However, many Americans still opposed it, and Woodrow Wilson won re-election in 1916 as a peace candidate, on the grounds that he had kept the country out of war. He outlined a patriotic and idealistic vision in which Allied and Central Powers opted to agree for a draw to end the conflict.
However, neither side was willing to concede so much after years of bitter and bloody conflict. The Germans made this especially clear on January 31, 1917, when they declared they would attack any seafaring vessel, belligerent or neutral, sailing towards Britain or France. The United Nations responded by breaking off all diplomatic ties with Germany.
One of the final tipping points that sent the United States off the same precipice of conflict that had claimed the nations of Europe 4 years prior was a diplomatic message sent by Germany to the Mexican government. Named for German Defense Secretary, the Zimmermann telegram was intercepted by the United States and published on March 1, 1917. It requested that Mexico join Germany in a war against the United States, for which it would later be rewarded with the territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, which were taken from Mexico in the previous century. Now, the majority of Americans demanded an entry into the war, but Wilson still hesitated.
Later that same year, in Russia, an important Allied power, revolution took hold. The oppressing imperialist regime had been overthrown by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, a democratic communist revolutionary group. While the October Revolution was initially greeted warmly by the United States, as it liberated the people in the style of the American Revolution, this gave way to shock and dismay when Lenin withdrew the newly founded USSR from the Great War.
Wanting to waste no more time and pressured by more attacks on U.S. shipping, President Wilson proposed to Congress that war be declared, saying, "We have no selfish ends to serve," and sugarcoated the war by saying it would make the world safe for democracy, and later that it would be a war to end war. America, which had once been an independent, isolationist nation, was now involved in a global conflict and would go on to play the role of peacemaker and international diplomat.
The entrance of the United States signaled a new era, the beginning of an international military presence. This new period had been brought on by the slow realization that foreign affairs often affected the United States too much to risk non-involvement. Starting with the sinking of the Lusitania and economic ties, and progressing with the Zimmerman telegram, American patriotism and war spirit blossomed in a way that would characterize the 20th century.